Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday from 1 p.m., both here at the building and online. So whether you're in Bristol or far away, you can join in the conversation. Hi everyone, my name is Celia. I'm going to describe myself. So I'm a woman in my 40s, Mediterranean, long hair braided to one side, black shirt, grey jeans. Every Friday we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio for Open Studio Friday, where we offer you the chance to spend time in the space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And especially big welcome to those who might be new to the studio, for whom this might be the first time engaging with us. Anyone new to the studio here? Brilliant, welcome. So what is the Pervasive Media Studio? This is for you especially. We are a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and from product development to performance art. It's a partnership between Watershed, UWI Bristol and University of Bristol and funded by Arts Council England. We offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events, opportunities to our residents as part of our spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. We are a space for people to take risks with embryonic ideas and to make time for collaboration. A few notes before we begin. Feel free to move around, make a cup of tea or grab a glass of water in the kitchenette there. We are a quiet space, we have a quiet space just next to us, so to my left and your right. For anyone who needs to take a break at any point, you can just go there. Fire exits are either end of the studio, and on one of the studio team will direct you if needed. Accessible toilet and baby change can be found at the corridor next to the kitchen. There is a Q&A at the end of the talk. For those who are watching online, pop your questions in the YouTube chat. Bridget will be your voice in the room today, and if you are in the building, just raise your hand and we'll send you around with a microphone for those who are at home to be able to hear your question. You can get news of all our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio and at Pervasive Media Studio at mastodon.social on Mastodon, at pmsstudio.uk.bsky.social on Blue Sky, at Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, and as you can see, we are not on X, Twitter anymore. Our speaker for today is Melanie Rieback. Melanie is the co-founder of Radically Open Security and of Post Growth, a startup incubator non-profit ventures. Today, she's going to talk about Post Growth Entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial methodology for creating non-extractive social business. She wants to make you question everything you know about entrepreneurship, provide practical tools for building something different, and ask if any of us can go back to business as usual again. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Melanie.
Hi. So thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks especially, of course, to Jill for organizing this here. So it's really, so my name is Melanie Rieback, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Radically Open Security. So basically, this is a not-for-profit computer security consultancy company. So what this means basically is that 10 years ago, I gave my company away, basically sold it for €1 to a foundation. Worst sale ever. But of course, I did this because I wanted to lock down the governance structure in such a way that I would realign financial incentives, and essentially by no longer being the owner of my own company, thus to sort of separate the profit rights from the voting rights, to really be able to ensure that all of my governance decisions would be made in such a way that they wouldn't be financially incentivized. Thus meaning that the only purpose for being that's left for the company is positive impact, right? And really just asking the question of how do you re-envision something like a cybersecurity company as a vehicle for pure positive impact. My motivations really for doing this was, I would say, a disagreement with the commercial cybersecurity industry, not always agreeing with the kinds of things that they do. So things like hacking activists, right? Because Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion are so terrifying. Selling zero-day vulnerabilities to nation states, which is basically weapons trade. And other things like building surveillance boxes and selling them to developing countries with authoritarian leaders. And then, of course, when the Dutch hacker community calls them on this and says, hey, can you stop doing this? Do they stop? No, they just sell that part of the company. So the other thing that I did with my company was use a kind of obscure Dutch tax construction from the Dutch church. So sometimes churches want to do a commercial spin-off. They sell some product or service of some kind, and then that money goes with a tax benefit back to the church. It's called a fiscal fundraising institution, fiscal fondswervende instelling in Dutch. And what this is one of the most famous examples of this in the Netherlands is a language institute known as Regina Caeli, also called the Nuns of Vught. Vught is this little village sort of in the south of the Netherlands. The nuns started the Language Institute. The Language Institute is awesome. Like our Queen Maxima, who's originally from Argentina, she learned her Dutch at this institute, and then the profits go back to the nuns. Now, the interesting part about this is it forces the business to donate 90% of its profits to charity. So not 5%, not 10%, 90%. And the last 10% of the profits is basically our cash flow buffer that we use to make payroll at the end of every month. So we chose really for this construction because it forced us then really put belts and braces on us as entrepreneurs to donate 90% to charity. It doesn't have to be a church. It can be actually any certified charity. And and the last 10% accumulates year on year as the cash flow buffer. Now, if you wonder how it's possible to operate a business this way, do not get confused. I said that we donate 90% of our profits, not 90% of our revenue. Right, and profits is really what we have after our customers have paid us, after we have paid our subcontractors for work rendered, after we have reinvested everything that we need into growth and stability of the company. Precisely because, we've got a lot of overhead. Things like project management, team, IT and infrastructure, a finance department, sales and marketing. I pull down a salary, of course. And it's only after all of these expenses are paid that we calculate the profits. And then 90% of this then goes to the NLNet Foundation, which is basically a Dutch charitable organization that funds open source digital rights projects and anything for an open internet. So over the last 10 years of Radically Open Security's existence, we have donated over 1 million euros to the NLNet Foundation. And our company has grown to round about 50 people. We've had hundreds of customers, including everything from Google and the European Commission and the Dutch energy grid, banks, insurance companies, telcos, hosting providers, core internet, but also SMEs, startups for a bit cheaper, and then not-for-profits, NGOs, and civil society organizations for whom we work on a non-profit basis at cost price, basically zero margin. And in such a way also with the not-for-profit sector, we have managed to work for customers like Greenpeace, Oxfam, tiny, free speech organizations of refugees, but also we've done a lot of work with sort of digital rights and online projects. We've worked with EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We've worked with the Tor Project, Tails, Global Leaks, Shadow Socks. So we really do a lot of work. Also with open source, a lot of core Unix things like iTerm, but also like the homebrew package manager. I mean, a lot of different things. So I would say that it's hard to find, actually, I think, a cybersecurity company that's also more tied in with nonprofits and civil society. And yet we also serve commercial customers. And it's precisely because we serve them at cost price. The big commercial governments, organizations, they allow us to kind of get the flywheel spinning. And once the flywheel is spinning, we can use that same flywheel with which to serve all these little guys for a very soft price that they can afford. And because we're doing it at zero margin rather than pro bono, that actually makes it infinitely scalable for us to be able to serve as many of these not-for-profits as possible. And I would say that these nonprofits are roughly a third of our clientele. Of course, we're getting in interesting times, and a few of my customers have actually gotten defunded over the last couple months, which is unfortunate. Anyway, but and this also, I think, leads to sort of interesting reflections because, as the funding of nonprofits and NGOs does become more volatile, shall we say, I think, in a way, it kind of places the burden and the responsibility of this on the private sector. And, I don't know the degree to which the existing private sector will do this. But I do think, though, that as entrepreneurs, we can basically create companies that can operate as kind of like sustainable funding sources for nonprofits and NGOs. It's the same way that with Radically Open Security, I mean, we're basically kind of a front-end vehicle for sending, these funds, to the back-end charity, in this particular case, the NLNet Foundation. And I also use some of this cash as well to also cross-subsidize my work on Post Growth Entrepreneurship, nonprofit ventures, so also for my own kind of like activistic initiatives, I also can use this commercial cybersecurity company, in a way, kind of as a funding vehicle for these other activities that don't financially stand on their own. And I think that, half the battle now in the world that we're living in is perhaps also teaching nonprofits and NGOs how to do this. Because, if funding sources, these external dependencies, if they are disappearing, right, if they're drying up, then of course the real question really becomes what's next? And we can't just have the entire not-for-profit sector folding, because USAID funding or whatever other funding, just so happens to be disappearing. But this, I think, really requires a mental shift on the behalf of those who are working in the not-for-profit sector. Because, activists are used to thinking of business as being evil. And this is very much justified, right? I mean, as they say, the root of all evil is the love of money. And yet, if we keep holding on, to this perception that business by necessity has to be evil, then it means that there is a tool that we're neglecting to use. That's actually quite a useful, potential tool in our arsenal. But the real thing becomes, how do we hold it? Because of course, business can have a corrupting influence. But with that love of money, I mean, that really is, of course, the extractive profit motive. And part of what you need to do then is to tame this extractive profit motive. And the ways that you can do this is by fundamentally realigning the governance structures of the companies themselves. And social enterprise is not enough. The triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit is not enough to get you there. Because as Muhammad Yunus says, anytime people and planet come into conflict with profit, the profit always wins. It's just a question of to what degree. So the triple bottom line is an impossible balance to maintain. But, the problem with the triple bottom line comes in our terminology, in our very semantics of how we're understanding the concept of profit. Because everyone thinks that they understand what profit is. But do they really? See, it turns out that profit has a double meaning. So the first meaning of the word profit is what I would call reinvestable margin. So I basically have a business and I sell you a banana, right? And then you buy this banana and then, I got it from my supplier. Excuse me. I put a margin, on top of that price when I'm selling it to you, and then I reinvest that margin back into my growing banana business, right? So this is absolutely essential for building businesses. If you have no margin, you don't have a business, like point blank. However, there's also a second meaning of the word profit, and that's financial extraction. And this, pays for my Lamborghini and for my big house, right? And the problem, of course, with this is that these two meanings are both embedded into the word profit, and it creates a kind of confusion in our heads. Because then the startup founder is going to say to you, well, of course my company needs to be profitable to survive. And of course, if he's talking about reinvestable margin, I completely agree, right? But the moment that we're talking about financial extraction, not only is it embedding toxic incentives into your company, but financial extraction is actually a competitive disadvantage on the market. Because cash that you pull out of a business is money that you don't have left over for research and development, and for paying your staff fairly, and for quality assurance on your products, right? And just in general, building better quality products and services, for people, or making your products cheaper for your customer base. So, in that sense, this is a problem. The not-for-profit sector has a similar problem with this double meaning. So nonprofits and NGOs, they understand that there should be no financial extraction. That part is clear. But the NGOs also think that they shouldn't have any reinvestable margin. And this is what creates the problems, because it gets the nonprofits caught in something that I would call the subsidy trap. And the subsidy trap is a bit like the poverty trap, like with people who get welfare. Because of this state welfare, it prevents them from doing things to make their lives better, like getting a job or starting a business, because the moment that they do and they start earning too much money, then they, of course, lose their state welfare, so they kind of get caught into this rock and a hard place. And it's the same thing, of course, with subsidies for NGOs, right? So this is really, I think, the second problem then with this double meaning. The third problem is in the triple bottom line of social enterprise. So people, planet, profit. But there's that word again. So actually what we have then is people, planet, reinvestable margin, financial extraction. So the real triple bottom line that we need is people, planet, reinvestable margin, and the financial extraction is the greenwashing. So if you want to remove the greenwashing from social enterprise, then it really is as simple as eliminating the financial extraction. But then, of course, the question becomes how? How does one eliminate financial extraction from business? And this really comes down to corporate governance. So typically with companies, of course, there are shareholders to every company. Legally, you need shareholders. You cannot register your company at the Chamber of Commerce without having shareholders. And yet there's also this concept of fiduciary responsibility, which is also part of the law, which basically makes a company's directors beholden legally to serving the so-called best interests of these shareholders. Of course, there are movements out there who have tried to alter their statutes, basically, and their other founding documents of the companies to try and overcome or this requirement and essentially soften, basically redefine fiduciary responsibility and what it means. And you see this, for example, in the B Corp, movement. I mean, they too were trying to also alter their founding documents to lessen, this fiduciary responsibility. And yet, of course, as we know and we've seen with the B Corp movement, of course, it doesn't necessarily get us all the way. Because, of course, it's still coming back to triple bottom line. And there's a huge difference between sort of like low profit corporations and non-profit corporations, right? But again, coming back to the word profit, it's actually not even not for profit, but it's non-extractive. The other thing also is that from a new economics perspective, we tend to talk about concepts like post-growth, degrowth, donut economics, well-being economy. And, we also, in doing, ask questions about things like GDP, gross domestic product, and asking really fundamental questions about growth, right? So, how much growth is good? When is growth good? Should we even be growing? Should we be shrinking, right? And I think there's also quite a bit of confusion in this whole discussion as well. First of all, I would say to the vast majority of the world, the term degrowth is pretty scary. And I think those of us on the left have actually given people quite a bit of reasons to feel this way. A lot of activists and Extinction Rebellion types, I think, now kind of embrace degrowth as a kind of way of saying, like, let's tear things down, which isn't really very helpful, in setting the narrative. But at the same time, though, we need to also understand, of course, degrowth is not the same thing as recession. And my favorite definition of degrowth actually comes from the author and philosopher Charles Eisenstein, and in his really wonderful book called Sacred Economics. And in this book, basically, he speaks about innovation. And for example, let's say that I'm a startup founder, right? And I want to create a business, and I need to find a business model for it. Typically, what they will tell you is find some kind of human, non-monetized human relationship or something in the commons. And then what you can do is basically find some way to be able to sell, this relationship or sell this sort of thing, this piece of commons, and wedge yourself in the middle as a platform, and voila, you've got your business model. But the real question is then, what actually is the opposite of this? Can we use something like business to instead be able to colonize the monetized economy, and then to be able to use our business to basically, take this, commodity, product, or service, and then use that to rebuild non-monetized human relationships and the commons. In other words, using business as a vehicle for decommoditization. And this, to me, is also degrowth. And people would think that degrowth business is a contradiction in terms, but it doesn't have to be. So post-growth as well, I think anyway a lot of these things really come from more or less a similar spirit. And of course, with post-growth, it's really asking the fundamental question of how can we be able to thrive without growth, right? And of course, economists like Kate Raworth and Tim Jackson, they all explain this extremely well. When they talk about how, basically the reason why GDP has to always be up and to the right is because there is so much financial extraction happening from our economies that we need to continue growing just to maintain a steady state. You know? But if, of course, you know, if we want to eliminate the financial extraction from our economies, this once again begs the question of how do we eliminate the financial extraction from our businesses? With the understanding that an economy is a meta-concept, which of course consists of businesses and governments and consumers and nonprofits and really all of us collectively. So I think that in concrete ways, you know, it requires looking at corporate governance, and this starts also by understanding alternate forms of ownership. And there's a number that are out there that are already quite well known. There's also some other ones that are a little less well known, but they're on their way up. I mean, you could start, of course, with concepts like cooperatives, right? And of course, the cooperative movement, I mean, I think, you know, it comes from the UK, I think, originally with Rochdale, right? It was sort of the start of the modern cooperative movement. And, you know, with cooperatives, basically what it is that you are taking profit rights and voting rights, and then you are distributing them to stakeholders. And those stakeholders, they could be employees, they could also be customers, you know, it could be some combination of the two. You could, you know, come up with other kinds of stakeholders. I think, though, that the main problem, though, with cooperatives is that you still have the profit rights and the voting rights being held by the same people, which basically means that these stakeholders, however well-meaning, can still collude, you know, and they are financially incentivized to collude and still, you know, sell their company to private equity or whoever, you know, because they can still financially enrich themselves through these exercise of governance decisions. Now, this brings us to another concept called steward ownership. Now, steward ownership really takes a different tack on this, and what it's doing is it is separating out profit rights from voting rights. And what this means is if someone is financially extracting from the business, then they cannot hold any voting rights. In other words, they cannot exercise any voting control or any governance control over the company. So what this means is that basically those who are holding the voting rights are essentially stewards, right? And they are stewarding then the operations of the company. And then the owners, you know, if they are extracting at all, then that basically they have no control over the operations of the company. Now, this is the basis of steward ownership. Steward ownership sometimes has stronger forms. And sometimes they introduce extra pieces such as golden shares and asset locks. And I'll explain to you what this means. So a golden share basically is a piece of stock that contains voting rights but no profit rights. And it ensures that the holder of this golden share can veto certain governance operations of the company. So for example, if I want to sell the company, the golden shareholder can veto that. And if I give my golden share to a steward ownership friendly organization, like for example, the Purpose Foundation in Germany that originated the concept, the modern concept of steward ownership, you know, it is basically their job to veto these kinds of governance operations. And it could be, you know, vetoing M&A, you know, mergers and acquisitions. It could also be vetoing changing the mission and purpose in your statutes. It could also be vetoing dividends out of the company. You can basically, it's just contract law, so you can basically put whatever you like into the golden share. But I do think, though, that M&A and dividend and mission and purpose are kind of the basics for something, for a golden share. So, and asset locks in general are basically just means like things like salary caps, and again, this is just stuff that you would write into your statutes that you lock in with the golden share. That can also include things like compensation caps for the executive team, for the board. of course, that leads to sticky discussions about fair compensation. I have no good answers for this because I think anyway, just there's no agreement on it. I mean, you can look basically at the multiples between the highest paid person versus the lowest paid person. You know, in the Netherlands, we have something called the Balkenende norm, which basically, Jan-Pieter Balkenende was one of our old prime ministers, and basically the Balkenende norm says you shouldn't earn more than the prime minister. So, I mean, there's many different ways to look at salary caps. That one I have no answer for you. And yet, but so I'm a very strong believer in asset locks and also in golden shares and in steward ownership. But keeping in mind that the weaker forms of steward ownership are not enough to get you there. So in other words, foundation ownership by itself is not enough. And of course, if you want evidence of this, I would point you to OpenAI. Because of course, they too were foundation owned until they weren't, right? But a golden share could have prevented that sale of equity to Microsoft initially, and that same golden share could have prevented them from reverting back into a public benefit corp. And by the way, about public benefit corporations in the US, particularly those in Delaware, they are not as social as they sound. There's a reason why companies, not just OpenAI, but also XAI from Elon Musk and Anthropic, why they are using these structures. It's quite simply because if you actually read the fine print on the legal forms for the public benefit corporations, it actually requires shareholders to have a certain percentage of shareholdings. I think it was something like, I'm forgetting now, it was like 20% or something, in order to be able to file a lawsuit questioning them on the degree to which they're balancing the triple bottom line, which in other words is actually functioning almost like a shield, actually, because even pension funds are not going to own that much equity most of the time in companies like that. And on top of that, because of this public benefit, name, it also, in a way, is also a shield that can also make them less, sort of more easily defensible in front of regulators. So that's part of the reason. I mean, I'm sorry to sound so cynical, but I think this is part of the reason why the Delaware Public Benefit Corporation right now is so popular amongst, these kinds of CEOs. So anyway. But the point is that we need to work knowledge of these kinds of things into our entrepreneurial ecosystems, because as a founder, typically when you go to a startup incubator, they are going to introduce you to the so-called Silicon Valley model style of entrepreneurship. So in other words, capital, scale, exit. That's what you learn. And it is completely unhelpful, particularly if you're hoping to build a social enterprise of any kind. And the problem is also that very frequently you get this same kind of capital scale exit model also even in impact incubators. Because, and this is somewhat of a problem, the actual business model of the incubators themselves. Because very frequently they take equity positions in their startups, which also, and it's always follow the money, follow the financial incentives, that even they too, will, their actual business model relies on some of their companies having exits. And this is, but not all incubators are like this. Academic incubators that are receiving funding from the government, of course, they have a very different business model, and because of that, they're much more likely to look kindly on these kinds of governance structures, precisely because it's interesting research. So, as usual, follow the money. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know about this incubation. I'm interrupting your talk, but I don't know about this incubation thing, and I don't know what you mean by exit either. Could you just explain?
Yes, of course. So an exit basically means selling the company. So if my company is taken over by another company through a merger or acquisition, that is an exit. I could also have an IPO, an initial public offering or direct listing on the stock market, going public. That's another way to have an exit. It's basically the cash out moment that a company has.
They did that with fracking. Watershed was intending on doing that with fracking in the UK. So Quadrilla was intending on doing this in the north of England with fracking.
Mm-hmm.
It was a smaller corporation intending to sell it on to a bigger fish.
Yeah.
And over 8 years they stopped it and they had to actually pull out because they couldn't do the selling.
Yeah.
That would be it.
Yeah. Yeah, the problem is that I think a lot of companies nowadays, they are built to be sold. And what frequently happens is that companies, they start with an infusion of investment capital, and they are instructed to grow as quickly as possible, which first of all leads them to a completely unsustainable burn rate inside the company, which means they're basically bleeding money. But the real thing is, they're at the heart of their business model, and I see this actually a lot in cybersecurity companies, actually. They are purporting to be cybersecurity companies making their money off of selling cybersecurity products and services. But truthfully speaking, they are so deeply in the red. What their actual business model is selling equity. Because the point where they actually make their money is when the company is acquired. And in the cybersecurity industry, because it's very difficult to hire qualified cybersecurity staff, there's a real talent shortage in the industry. It's far easier for a big fish like Google or Facebook or whoever, to basically just, you want a bunch of cybersecurity experts, buy the company, right? And then, but the problem is this is incredibly destructive when this happens, because at that point, whatever product and service typically the people were working on is discarded because actually they were a quote unquote acqui-hire, right? So the actual product and service was aside, kind of beside the fact of why the company was acquired to begin with. And then this company just gets absorbed, into this larger acquiring entity. And then it's almost like that company had never existed in the first place. And this happens almost universally because in the Netherlands, again, I have a 10-year-old, 50-person cybersecurity company. We are, to the best of my knowledge, the only Dutch cybersecurity company of this size and this age that has not been acquired. Every single other company has been acquired once, if not twice. And I can remember one company, it started as a very small sort of counterculture, open source friendly, hacker outfit, and then they got acquired by, and even with this acquisition process, also what happens is there's always a culture clash between the acquirer and the acquiree, and as soon, of course, as soon as you acquire a company full of like Unix nerds, and then the acquiring company says, oh, by the way, we're using Windows now, then of course, it's just like a matter of a month or two before all the senior staff leaves. They're all just like, yeah, screw this. And and then this company got acquired a second time by some offshore company. At a certain point, it's not even about cybersecurity anymore. It's just an asset. So, and then the senior people who leave then go and guess what they do? They create another startup and then they get venture capital funding and then, thus goes the entire merry-go-round again. And it's just completely distracting us, right? Because, and with something like cybersecurity, it's supposed to be about making the world more cybersecure. It's supposed to be about protecting people's personal data. It's supposed to be about privacy, And yet, because we're too busy just building little tiny wheels that are meant to be absorbed, we don't need 1 million proprietary tiny wheels. We actually need just a smaller number of big wheels that we can sort of crowdfund together by customer procurement and then open source and allow other people to build to. But this requires a different mindset, right? And even in things like, technology transfer offices at universities, And this starts to actually play into the, Mariana Mazzucato's work. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she's also an economist at the University College London. And she's written many absolutely wonderful books, including one that's called The Entrepreneurial State. And in her book, her thesis is that the government is the world's largest venture capitalist, but we're socializing the costs and we're privatizing the benefits. And the way that this works is with this academic that you have at the university, they are doing publicly funded research. But the problem is, the moment that they want to valorize their research and they go to the technology transfer office, typically what happens is they will get introduced to the academic incubator that's affiliated with the university. And then they will put them into this, startup boot camp, just as I was when I first started Radically Open Security, where, they fly in then somebody from Stanford who then, on day one of the startup boot camp gives you the PowerPoint slide with the exponential curve on it, right? And then who tells you as a founder that, and by the way, your definition of success in entrepreneurship is to sell the company. But it's precisely in this introduction of venture capital that the founders lose control over the company, and this is actually the moment where the benefits become privatized. And it's so weird, and also the mindset of technology transfer offices. I mean, they typically want to patent everything that moves. But how ironic is this? You're putting up financial barriers to entry to people using the outcomes of publicly funded research. How much sense does this make? And the solution to this, I believe, is steward ownership with strong asset locks. Because, if we take this publicly funded work, we can still valorize it, but just by putting it into companies that have governance that is where the financial incentives are fundamentally realigned, where the companies are basically more or less self-owned, independent from investors. You can run successful companies this way. Similarly, I think that we also need to work this into the finance sector. And what we can do is we can create steward-owned investment funds. And there are a few examples of these already that are out there. Things like Purpose Ventures, from the Purpose Foundation, like Snowball Impact Management by Daniela Baroni Suarez. And more are starting to pop up in different places. There's also a few new ones also in the Netherlands that are just starting, And of course, with my real hope also for those that are educating the finance sector, that we're going to be promoting the creation of more steward-owned funds. And not just, to fund steward-owned companies, because there's already some talk about how do you fund steward-owned companies, but rather just like financially realigning the fund itself. And the other part of realigning the incentives of the fund is also looking very carefully at fees within the funds, realigning things like carried interest, and understanding that, and also just a quick explanation for those of you who don't understand how venture capital works. The typical, fee structure for most venture capitalists is what's known as the 220. So in other words, 2% asset under management fee, 20% carried interest. I'll tell you what this means. So if I'm a venture capitalist and you are my portfolio company, if you grow exponentially and exit, I get 20% of that. And that is a really powerful motivator for me as a venture capitalist to push you to grow exponentially and to exit. So you can say that this 20% carry embeds the growth imperative into startups. If you want to eliminate the growth imperative from these startups, it really is as simple as eliminating the carried interest from the fee structure of the fund manager. And you can do this. And there are fund managers who have already done this. The 2% management fee is also highly extractive, not for small fund managers, but if you have a fund of 1 billion or larger, then it starts to get extractive. And if you're BlackRock, then, forget about it. So basically what you can also do is reform that 2% into the cost of running the business, assuming middle-class salaries and a pension. which basically means that fund managers would be middle class. God forbid. But what this means is that everything else then gets reinvested, recycled back into the fund, so the fund can actually really do what it's supposed to be doing, which basically means moving capital, in such a way that we can best serve, the world through building businesses, And this is the thing with impact VC. They will say, for me, it's all about the impact. But where the rubber really meets the road is when you say to them, oh, okay, but then have you thought about making your fund steward-owned and restructuring your 220, to make it less extractive? And some of the fund managers were like, I didn't mean that. And those are the ones that are happy to, keep benefiting from greenwashing. And, those who are willing, those who are open-minded. But keep in mind, there's institutional barriers too. So even the GPs, the fund managers who are willing to do this, also run into barriers with the limited partners, with their customers, particularly with the institutional investors, because they don't understand this stuff either. Because if you want to get rid of the 20% carried interest, a pension fund is just going to look confused, and they're going to say, oh, but this is an incentive misalignment. Just assuming that the greediest fund manager is somehow going to be the best fund manager. And yet, more fees doesn't lead to better returns, for pensioners. So what are we talking about? But the point is, though, that these conversations are not happening in the places where they need to be happening. And it really all starts with understanding the problem. Because we all know that there's problems in the world today, and we all blame the system. Right? Systemic problems. But then when you ask people to tell you, well, okay, great, explain the system to me. What is the system? What are the pieces? What are the moving parts? How do they fit together? How do they interlock, right? And most importantly, where do we wedge the ice pick to get the whole thing to behave in a different fashion, right? And the only way to be able to do this is to think like a hacker and say, how do I take this machine apart? So I can understand it. It's the same thing as systems thinking, from Donella Meadows and sort of looking for leverage points in the system, because it's precisely those leverage points where we can make the most change. With the understanding that leverage points are things like financial incentives, are things like the definition of fiduciary responsibility, that other leverage points are things like compliance requirements and due diligence requirements, particularly in the finance sector, are also things like governance structures, are also things like proxy voting at AGMs, And once you start understanding really how the system works, that's when, as a good activist, you start really understanding how to use business and finance as a tool to make lasting, meaningful change. So anyway, I hope that this talk has been interesting to you, hopefully has gotten you to think about business and finance and entrepreneurship in a different way. And if this topic is interesting to you, you should know that my Post Growth Entrepreneurship class from the University of Amsterdam, I filmed it, put it for free online on YouTube, and it's actually pinned to the top of my LinkedIn profile. It's 11 hours of video, so it's a long sit. But if you want to hear more about this in more detail, I would highly invite you to have a look at these videos. Anyway, thank you. Questions?
Let's start.
Hello, thank you so much. Really interesting talk. I actually work at the business school in the University of Bristol, in a kind of radical corner. I've actually got lots of questions, but I'll maybe save some of them. I suppose one comment. I was interested in your take on co-ops, which is obviously the kind of it's a traditional critique, traditional critique of co-ops, that they can still be used to create profit for their members. I mean, my own, this is just a comment, but my own experience is that actually, even though they use the term surplus, they fall into a similar problem of not recognising that it's fine to make a surplus.
Yeah.
and they use it as if it's profit, but it's, I think the term surplus is actually quite useful, but they don't tend to use it. But I have a question about DAOs, so decentralized autonomous organizations, and I'm just wondering what your take is on them, because there's a big debate as to whether they're just, because of being built on blockchain, they're built on essentially mistrust, or whether they've got liberatory potential, radical potential.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for the question. So first, I'm going to address your comment about cooperatives. One thing I forgot to mention is that actually you can combine cooperatives with steward ownership for what I believe is sort of best of breed. I mean, you can have the best of both worlds. So what you can actually do is take the voting rights and then distribute them amongst the stakeholders. And then you can take the profit rights and then lock them into a foundation with a golden share. And at that point, you basically have a steward-owned cooperative. And to me, that's the best. So, okay, your next question was about DAOs. And the first thing that I will say is, as a cybersecurity professional, I am a blockchain skeptic. And with that, I would refer you to a YouTube video that I recorded back in 2019, which was a 20-minute long rant about why the cybersecurity of blockchain is a complete and total disaster. The problem is that the technology itself has a number of problems, and it makes a lot of promises that it very frequently, from a cybersecurity perspective, is not able to fulfill. In part, it's because of the actual application software that it is interfacing with, because as a computer hacker, I can tell you with quite some certainty that there is no perfect software. But the problem, though, is that blockchain, in the immutability of its ledger, it basically means that if you have functional problems or if you have security holes that you need to patch, the problem is that if you need to change the format of how you're storing the data, you basically need to go back in time, fork basically the blockchain, and then rewrite everything, from that point forward. And that makes it really difficult to make security fixes. And I've seen a lot of blockchain pilots torpedoed, most of the time for functional reasons, because it also makes fixing functional problems equally hard. But just like understanding that if you have something like, let's say that you have the Bitcoin blockchain, what most people don't realize is there's all kinds of crap in there, because there's tools in there to embed stuff. There's ASCII art. There's, exploit code, that's embedded into the Bitcoin blockchain. I've heard rumors that there's child pornography embedded in there as well. And then let me ask you the question of, once it's in there, how are you going to get it out again? And this is the problem with the blockchain. If it was just a database, then you could basically go and just edit it out and you're fine. But precisely that selling point of blockchain, its immutability, that basically makes it almost impossible to fix these kinds of problems. Not to mention GDPR compliance. If people's private data get in there, how are you going to give them a right to be able to revise, their personal details if something is incorrect, or to be able to eliminate, their personal details, from this record? You can't. And this is, I think, a large part of what's problematic about blockchain. And it's mostly been overhyped by, first of all, people who lack the technical background, that they actually don't understand what they're talking about. And secondly, it's also promoted by those who typically have a financial interest in the technology. And that's either investors who are invested in blockchain companies, or founders of blockchain companies, or it's people who are personally invested in cryptocurrency. They're the ones who have relentlessly overhyped this technology. But I'll tell you, if you want to see a lot of eyeballs roll, go to a big cybersecurity conference like DEF CON, and then just shout blockchain, and you'll see it. And trust me, if the cybersecurity industry does not believe in it, then you shouldn't either.
Hiya. I've got a question from Brendan online, who says, can you please dig a bit deeper into how not not-for-profits differ from a business that doesn't extract finance that you mentioned earlier? Also, are there models where entrepreneurs are directed into being set up as a business for public profit rather than into VC and private profit, essentially becoming a money-making arm of the government?
Okay, so there were two questions here. One question basically is, what is the difference between a not-for-profit and a non-extractive company? I'll start with this one. So a not-for-profit typically is externally funded, which basically means it's receiving either donations or subsidies. In other words, it doesn't have a revenue stream. Whereas with a non-extractive business, it's still a business. So it has a product or service that it sells, and it has revenue, right? And then it reinvests that revenue into the operation of the business. So basically what it is it is a social enterprise with a governance structure that, again, implements steward ownership and strong asset locks to lock the value of the company inside the company to ensure that you have full reinvestment that basically supports the mission and purpose of the company. That is a radically different thing than a nonprofit or an NGO. And again, like subsidies and donations are super vulnerable. First of all, because it's not reoccurring necessarily. You just get a one-time cash infusion from a donor and then that's it. And on top of that, oftentimes there's strings attached to these donations. Plus, you can very easily be defunded. So this is it's just a completely different animal. I mean, kind of a business versus a nonprofit. I mean, and I'm not saying that the nonprofit sector doesn't have its place. I mean, it most certainly does. But I do think, though, that these days, given the political climate we're in, we really need to start coupling nonprofits and NGOs with back-end vehicles. And the thing is also, try not to make your business too, quote-unquote, innovative. Like, you don't need to blaze trails of innovation. Just instead, take some really basic commodity. Just take some easy cash cow that you can use, just something that everybody needs. It could just be like food or just bog standard, like socks. Like everybody needs socks. Just take something that people need and that people are willing to pay money for, and just start with something like that. Because then you basically automatically will have a customer base, and then you'll have revenue. And the main thing is, what should be innovative about your business is the business model. It doesn't necessarily have to be the product or service itself. Because even with radically open security, we sell penetration tests. We sell security audits. That's not all that fundamentally different from what all the other cybersecurity, sort of companies with ethical hackers, provide on the market. But what's innovative about us, of course, is our business model. And we've got a few other things that are innovative, like with the cross-subsidizing for nonprofits, and we have an open and transparent workflow for our penetration testing too. But anyway, that's not the point here. But the point here is that really just that try not to make things too fancy and just understand, it's almost like, Tim Ferriss says in 4-Hour Work Week, you're trying to create this muse basically not to fund yourself so you can go drink coconuts on the beach, but rather you're just trying to fund this not-for-profit, that then can go then do the activistic work or social work that it needs to be doing. So the second question, I forgot what the second question was.
Where entrepreneurs are directed into being set up as business for public profit.
Right. So you're basically asking, are there any incubators that will help to create the kinds of companies that I'm describing? Well, first of all, I have an incubator that's called Nonprofit Ventures, and we have run 5 cohorts of incubators through our program. We've incubated almost 70 startups. Based upon, basically all of these principles. We also, by the way, had a separate Train the Trainers program, which also some of the attendees here attended, so that was also quite nice. The problem that I'm having right now with the incubator is that we're getting too popular. I'm starting to get numbers of applications that actually exceed my ability to be able to handle it. So what I'm actually working on doing right now is we're creating a playbook for the PGE incubator, And I'm going to be hopefully releasing it sometime in the next year. We're going to, as open source, with the idea that people can start organizing their own PGE incubators. And by the way, another thing that I can say is already organically happening is there are people who are creating independently operating study groups based around the 11-hour PGE videos that I put online. And they're coming together with usually one video per week and having self-guided discussions on each of the videos, and then basically looking to translate this into their own local context. And this is where it starts, because when we do start putting out the playbook, actually part 1 of this playbook is going to be for going through the theory videos and having these kinds of independent learning circles. And then step 2 is basically adding the incubation component, and this is really basic stuff like business model canvases, lean startup, MVPs, mom testing, and then eventually leading to a demo day where you're basically presenting to a broad audience what you're doing in a way that you can collect feedback from the audience members. That's basically it. This stuff is not rocket science. So, I'm hoping then in moving forward that others, rather than scaling nonprofit ventures as an organization up, I would far prefer to scale it out horizontally instead. And rather than, everybody coming to nonprofit ventures, I would prefer that everyone creates their own PGE incubator. And in that sense, who knows, maybe we can have some Bristol non-extractive, incubator. And anybody who wants to start such an initiative or who wants to lead such an initiative or who's interested in dog fooding the materials that I'm currently working on, I would just say, please approach me, because we already have a good portion of these materials developed. And I'm actually also looking for trailblazers who are willing to get started with implementing these things.
I'm afraid we don't have any more time for questions, but Melanie will be here if you want to approach with a question after we're over. And before we go, a reminder that there's no talk next week because of the bank holiday, so we'll see you here in 2 weeks at 1 p.m. And if you want to stick around on Hot Desk today, please do so, or you can find out more about what we do also by asking a member of the team, of the studio team, that is, we are waving our hands if you want to come and talk to us. If you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk if you have any questions. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Melanie. It's been absolutely great.